Okay, through the chair, it looks like we are live on YouTube, so we can go ahead and start the meeting whenever you would like. Just a reminder to everybody, if you can turn off your microphones or mute yourself unless you're speaking, just so we don't have feedback, that'd be greatly appreciated.
Okay, thank you, Director Flanagan. And welcome everyone. Welcome to summer and to our June meeting. So we just have, there's a couple of announcements in your agendas about fly fishing opportunity and some events at Camp Tiffin as usual for over the summer. So I'd like to call our meeting to order at 9 o'clock on June the 23rd. And we do have regrets today from Councillor Harvey. And I believe Councillor Cox will be joining us a little bit late, a few minutes late. So is Mayor White on the line? Is he on the call? Oh, he hasn't joined yet. So Mayor Darren White was going to do the land acknowledgement this morning. So I see he hasn't joined us yet. So I guess I will just step in his place. So I would like to say the Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority Board acknowledges that we are situated in the traditional land of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Odawa, the Saulteaux, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Algonquin, who spoke several languages, including Anishinaabe and Potawatomi to me. We are dedicated to honoring the Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. The next item is the declaration of pecuniary interest. If anyone has a declaration to make, you may make it now or anytime throughout the meeting. So we have a motion to adopt the agenda. Again, Mayor White has not joined us yet. Oh, he has? Welcome, Mayor White. I'm sorry, I just did the land acknowledgement because I didn't believe you were online yet, but we do.
I apologize. I had some technical problems this morning as people have.
Surprise, surprise. What's a meeting, as we said, without technical issues? So we do have you moving the motion to adopt the agenda and Councillor Blanger as a seconder. Is there any discussion? If not, again, using your onboard meeting, could you go and vote on that motion, please?
Through the chair, that motion has carried.
Good. We can now proceed. Okay. There are no announcements this morning that I am aware of, unless anybody has something they wanted to share with the board. And we will then move on to our presentation. Today we have Sean Michael Stephen here with us from Watson and Associates to talk about our program rates and fees. So I will turn it over to Sean Michael.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. And welcome, Sean.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just having a technical issue for one moment. Just bear with me.
Absolutely.
Okay, sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. So thanks for having me here this morning. Pleased to be speaking to you about this exercise we've been undertaking with staff over the past number of months. Next slide, please. So In terms of the program rates and fees review that we've undertaken and the objectives and deliverables of that review. So when this assignment commenced, the principal objective was to make fee recommendations for the fees that are imposed for plan review and permitting by the authority. As with the legislative changes that have occurred throughout the study process, there have been some tweaks to those deliverables in terms of how they've been framed within that legislative authority. But principally, one of the main deliverables before looking at fee recommendations was the first go through a staff in a fairly comprehensive way to assess what the full costs are of providing the plan review and permitting activities. And then including assessing what the potential impacts are of the Bill 23 legislative changes that we'll talk about in a bit more detail in terms of how those impact conservation authorities' involvement in the development approvals processes. And then in making fee recommendations to either recover the full cost or improve your cost recovery levels and decrease the burden on the municipal levy to fund those services, want to do so making sure up in regard for the governing legislation that those fees are defensible, and then wanting to balance that need to maximize cost recovery with the interests of the various stakeholders, as well as the affordability and competitiveness of those fees. And on those last two items, especially when looking at minor plan review and permitting fees that are paid by existing residents, wanting to make sure that those fees are reasonable and affordable. And then looking at fee structures reflecting industry best practices as well. Next slide, please. So just to touch briefly on the legislative context for the fee review, much of this which you'll be quite aware of already, but just in terms of how this sets the context for the review that was undertaken. Section 21 of the Conservation Authorities Act does provide authorities the ability to charge fees for services, which include plan review and Section 28 permitting. Recently, the province has released the minister's list of classes of programs and services for which you may impose a fee. And so within that list, it does identify that the fees that are charged must be a user fee and that you can demonstrate there is a direct benefit of service received. And so the process we've gone through has looked at directly what is involved in those processes to be able to confer that benefit. And then with respect to the planning and permitting fees that are imposed, it's stated that the fees and the revenues associated with those fees cannot be greater than the cost of administering and delivering those services on a program basis. So plan review and permitting separately, we can look at not only the direct cost of delivering those services, but as well as the indirect support costs of administering those services overall on a program basis of plan review versus permitting. And then as well, what's identified is that the fees for planning services, for plan review, should be developed in conjunction with the appropriate planning authorities. And so from that, we've looked at the aligning our methodology with the approach that we would utilize for municipalities when looking at their planning application fees in terms of only assessing what are the costs of processing those applications. And then with the More Homes Built Faster Act, Bill 23, that received royal assent in November of last year, the areas in which there are changes and proposed changes to the Conservation Authorities Act that have been factored into this review include, first of all, obviously that for this calendar year, authorities cannot change their fees for plan review or permitting as that direction was given. There is at this point, no further direction on that being extended beyond 2023. But then as well, the additional changes in terms of where conservation authorities can be involved in the development review process is that they would no longer be able to review applications made under a prescribed act. And so the main impact here is that removing the ability to comment on natural heritage reviews. That's one area we've looked at in terms of what impact that would have on the involvement of staff within these plan review processes. And then as well, it's proposed that through regulations, certain low-risk development activities, as well as developments associated with a Planning Act application would not require a permit. And so we've looked at the potential impact on revenues and costs associated with those activities no longer being required. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of a slide without asking you to move on. Sorry, next slide again. And so with the intent for the presentation today is to look at under 3 separate scenarios, how are staff being utilized and what's the cost of that level of staff involvement on plan review and permitting. So firstly, under your current service levels and average annual application and permit volumes that you would have been seeing. The second scenario then we looked at with staff in terms of the fact that your current service levels are deficient in some areas, and that staff have identified that additional resources are required to provide the desired level of service in terms of the plan review and permitting process, and that would require the addition of a senior planner, a water resource engineer, or technologist, and a senior regulations technician. And then the third scenario we looked at was building off of that second scenario with those desired service levels, but then what would the impact be with the Bill 23 changes in terms of reductions in involvement from ecology and engineering positions with the removal of natural heritage, and as well as a potential reduction in development permit volumes with the certain low-risk development permits not being required, as well as permits associated with Planning Act applications. And then we'll conclude in looking at with these various scenarios and proposed fees to improve cost recovery, what would that impact be on the municipal levy? Next slide, please. And again, so first, in terms of just to give you a quick overview of the methodology we utilized to assess what the full costs were, we use an activity-based costing methodology in which we first went through in detail with staff on the right-hand side what the costing categories are that we'd be looking at. And so when we're referring to costing categories, we're talking about not just the various application types or permit types that you impose fees for, but as well as other subsets of those activities that you may not specifically have fees for, to understand in detail how does the level of effort and therefore the costs of these different processes and activities that staff are engaged on, what those are. And so we looked at those within plan review permitting, as well as some other miscellaneous service channels that watershed management staff would be involved in. We then looked in detail at what is the process that staff would proceed through in any of these various permit or plan review types, who is involved in those processes, and how much time would those staff positions spend on a typical basis. And then we went through, again, a detailed process with staff to then test the reasonableness of those effort estimates when we look at what does that mean in terms of annual staff involvement, when we consider how many of those permits and applications staff would have to review, to make sure that those effort estimates are representative of service levels that can actually be delivered. And then based on that annual deployment of staff across those various costing categories, not only the direct resource cost of those individuals, so the salary, wage, and benefit costs are allocated, but as well as the other departmental direct costs for things like materials and supplies, as well as other support costs of the organization for corporate services, for example, allocated to those costing categories based on the deployment of staff. Next slide, please. And again. So using that approach then for the 3 scenarios we were looking at, as we can see on the first bar on the left-hand side, of the just over 18 full-time equivalent staff positions within watershed management services, about 74% of those positions are utilized on plan review and permitting, with that distribution split fairly evenly between the 2 two areas, slightly more time being spent on plan review than permitting. And the reason this is only 74% of the 18 positions that within watershed management services, there are positions such as flood forecasting positions that are not heavily involved in watershed science positions as well, that aren't heavily involved in the plan review and permitting processes. In the second scenario, then adding the 3 additional positions that would be required to improve service levels, we can see that increases the number of staff that would be utilized in these processes to 16.5 full-time equivalent staff positions. And then the third scenario, with the downward impacts on staff involvement with the Bill 23 changes, we can see about a 0.8 decrease in the number of full-time equivalent staff positions that would be involved in the plan review and permitting processes. Next slide, please. So then based on that level of staff involvement, we've then determined what those full costs of service would be. And we can see for the scenario 1 that the current service levels and volumes just under $1.8 million in annual costs. Those costs would increase by about $315,000 to just under $2.1 million under scenario 2 with the addition of the 3 staff positions. And then under scenario 3 with a slightly lower level of involvement annually from those positions, we see about a $100,000 decrease versus scenario 2, or about a $216,000 increase over scenario 1, about $1.9 million in annual costs of plan review and permitting services. We look at how those costs break down across the various cost components. In the dark blue and orange section are the direct costs of service, which represent approximately 78% of the annual costs. And the remaining costs are made up by about 20% being the indirect support costs and about 2% for capital costs, which largely relate to a recognition for annual capital replacement costs for the facility space that staff occupy in the delivery of their duties. Next slide, please. And then just to highlight for you quickly within plan review and permitting, where are the major areas or the major types of applications and permits that staff are involved in. You can see of that roughly $1.8 million, about 28% of that in the green section is related to issuing development permits. And about 12% within what we call the permitting category is related to unauthorized works and attempting to gain compliance for those unauthorized works. So a fair bit of staff time and cost being expended in that regard. On the plan review side, the largest area of involvement is in the light blue section for combined applications, about 21% of the annual cost. And combined applications, we're referring to Planning Act applications that are received concurrently. So for example, when an applicant submits an official plan amendment, a zoning bylaw amendment at the same time, or a subdivision and zoning bylaw amendment applications concurrently. Significant time also being spent on committee of adjustment applications, about 9% of annual costs, being minor variance and consent applications, and site plan applications as well, representing about 8% of annual costs or staff involvement. Next slide, please. So then for these 3 scenarios, we wanted to look at was under the current fees, how are those costs being funded from user fees versus the municipal levy contributions. And so in the green section is the portion of those annual costs that would be funded through your current plan review and permitting user fees, and the dark blue section being the portion that would be funded through the municipal levy. And so under your current scenario, about 71% of those costs, about just under $1.3 million, are funded through user fees, meaning about just over 500,000 of those costs of service are being funded from the municipal levy. And then in the second scenario, when we add the 3 additional staff positions to improve service levels, as with fees being unchanged, those additional costs will be funded from the municipal levy, increasing that levy funding back to about $823,000. And in the third scenario, we can see that levy funding decreases slightly as there would be a slight decrease in the involvement of staff in these activities, with about $738,000 being funded from the levy, and the remainder of those costs being funded through the user fees that would be in place. Next slide, please. And again, so then in terms of looking at the fee recommendations to improve cost recovery that could potentially be put in place in 2024, they've been made with regard for the obviously the legislative authority to impose those fees on a program basis for plan review and permitting. And again, wanting to make sure we have regard for the affordability and competitiveness of the fees, and as well as industry best practices in terms of having uniform fees across your watershed. The fee recommendations are being put forth, which are all in 2023 values to recover your current budgeted costs, are anticipated to recover the full cost of plan review and move towards full cost recovery levels for permitting. The reason permitting fees will not be set at full cost recovery levels overall across that program is that when we consider the enforcement activities, which it's difficult to recover the entirety of those costs for, as well as general inquiries and legal and real estate inquiries being set at market rates, there are activities there in which are part of your service delivery objectives in terms of being able to provide that public consultation and general inquiry processes, and having to undertake your enforcement activities for which you wouldn't be able to recover the full cost for. Next slide, please. Just to highlight a few of the changes to the fees that are being recommended. Firstly, for plan review, is that for site-specific official plan and zoning bylaw amendment applications, those be increased to full cost recovery levels. And then as well, there would be new fees introduced to differentiate between scoped and full technical reviews to reflect that there are differences in complexity of review that the authority undertakes. Site plan applications for residential applications would be no change to fees, but for other non-residential applications, fees would be increased to full cost recovery levels. For Planning Act applications that are received concurrently, as I mentioned as an example, subdivision and zoning bylaw amendment applications, only the higher of the two application fees would apply, to recognize that there are some economies of scale that exist when processing these applications concurrently, and that not all components of those reviews would need to be duplicated. And then with committee of adjustment applications, minor variance consent applications, as well as Niagara Escarpment Commission applications, those fees have been set at levels consistent with those in other conservation authorities, which are slightly below full cost recovery levels. Next slide, please. On the permitting side, the fees for development permits have been increased to full cost recovery levels. On the next slide, please, which are consistent with the fees that are in place in other conservation authorities across the province. We've maintained the discounted fee for agricultural permits that was established in 2016. And then for legal and real estate inquiries, which there are a fair number of in terms of the volumes of those annually, we've increased that fee from $214 to $315 within our recommendations, which is still within the range of those fees imposed within other conservation authorities to improve cost recovery levels in that regard. Next slide, please. So then this table is comparing the current costs and revenue performance under your current scenario 1 versus the scenario 3 being the desired service levels and the Bill 23 impacts. And so as we can see under your current scenario, overall, you'd be recovering about 71% of those costs, with plan review fees performing much better than permitting fees, with plan review recovering about 87% of those costs and permits recovering about 84% of their cost of service. Overall, as we identified earlier, but a $500,000 deficit being representing the amount of the cost that would be funded through the municipal levy. With the recommended fees, we can see that there would be an annual revenue increase from about $1.2 $1.26 million to about $1.82 million, an increase of about just under $560,000, or a 44% increase in annual revenue, resulting in a shortfall of about $164,000, about 92% cost recovery overall. And so in comparison to the current scenario, which as we're currently operating in, is about $508,000 that would be funded through the levy for these full costs of service. Under scenario 3, which adds the additional staff positions and the additional costs associated with them, and with the proposed fee recommendations, there would actually be a decrease in the municipal levy funding for plan review and permitting services of about $343,000, a decrease from about $508,000 to $165,000 overall. So positive in that regard, even though still not moving to full cost recovery levels, with the additional staff positions, still decreasing the draw on the municipal levy for these services. Next slide, please. And then so lastly, to look at the impact of these fees on in terms of the Planning Act application, or the plan review application fees. First of all, what we wanted to look at was not just the total fees that are imposed by the conservation authorities and how those compare across Ontario, but also looking at the significance of conservation authority plan review fees in terms of the context of the total development, municipal and conservation authority development fees that an applicant would pay for certain development types. And so we looked at not just the conservation authority fees, but as well, what are the municipal development charges, planning application fees, and building permit fees that an applicant have to pay to understand the context of these plan review fees in terms of that total cost of municipal and conservation authority development. And so we looked at this for a 100-unit low density development, as well as a 25-unit medium density development within your watershed and surrounding conservation authority watersheds. And overall, what the impact is that your position in terms of the fees within Nottawasaga versus other conservation authorities would remain unchanged, as your fees represent, depending on the two application types, between 0.2 and 1.5% of the total development fees that would be payable. And so we can see that on the next slide. We can see that graphically in terms of where Nottawasaga ranks. First of all, on the top for a 100-unit single attached subdivision is that those fees are in the lower grouping of conservation authorities, similar to those in Kawartha Conservation Authority, Grey Sauble, and Grand River, much lower than the fees imposed in some of the conservation authorities that are a little bit closer to the GTA in terms of TRCA, Conservation Halton, Lake Simcoe, Credit Valley, and Central Lake Ontario. And we see a similar impacts for the 25-unit medium density development, where again that position remain unchanged. The fees within Nottawasaga being in that lower mid-range of the comparison. On the next slide, just to highlight the impacts in terms of the development permit fees and the recommendations. And so we've looked here at a minor, intermediate, and major development permit. As we can see, currently your fees rank towards the bottom of the conservation authorities that we surveyed, with the recommendations to move to full cost recovery levels for those development permits. And we can see that would move Nottawasaga towards the mid-range of that comparison, similar to the fees in Saugeen Valley Conservation Authority and Grey Sauble as well. Next slide, please. So lastly, in terms of next steps, staff will be monitoring further regulatory changes that are brought forward by the province and what those impacts might be in terms of the level of staff involvement and volume of permitting activity that would need to be reviewed and processed by the authority. And and with monitoring those impacts, considering any impacts to the proposed fees before considering those for implementation in 2024, assuming the authority is allowed to change your fees at that time. Before doing so, there would be further consultation with stakeholders and the board of directors. And again, with the anticipated implementation being in January of 2024 for updated fees to improve cost recovery levels and be able to recover the cost of the increases, the increased staff requirements for providing the desired service levels as well. So that does conclude my presentation. I'm available if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Sean Michael. So I would open the floor to any questions if any of the members have further clarification or discussion. Councillor Baines.
Thank you, Chair Little. Through you to Sean Michael. A lot of figures. Thank you very much for this analysis. It's very thorough. But what I think I'm taking out of this, based on, I think, page 3 or 4, when you got into this of a chart showing scenarios 1, 2, and 3, it looked like if we implement your recommendations that user fees on as a whole would go down 10%, excuse me, of operating revenue, and that the municipal levy would increase under both scenario 2 and scenario 3. Is that correct?
So that was illustrating the impact at current fees. So if you didn't change your fees and you added additional staff for to meet those service levels, then those additional staffing costs would be funded from the municipal levy. So if the province continued to restrict you from changing your fees, for example, there would be a levy impact. What I was attempting to highlight at the end of the presentation was that with these additional staffing costs, and if you are able to increase your fees as proposed within our report, your municipal levy, the amount of levy funding towards these services would actually decrease by almost $350,000.
Thank you. And just one follow-up question. The distinction between scenario 2 and scenario 3 is if Bill 23 wasn't around, we could proceed with scenario 2, but because Bill 23 is an operating reality, we have to proceed with scenario 3, do we not?
Yes, and maybe just to reiterate that within scenario 3, we've had to make some assumptions with staff because some of the regulations haven't yet been released that would put in place some of these changes. So we don't yet know what the true impact of that is until we see those regulations and staff are able to monitor how that actually comes into place within their day-to-day operations.
Thank you very much. No further questions.
Thank you. Councillor Belanger.
Yes, thank you. Through you, the chair. When we do the analysis, there is a cost to follow up. I've certainly been very involved in following up certain applications, which takes up time from our CAO. It takes up time with them following up with staff. So I'm certainly a strong advocate to add staff and ensure that we're streamlining the process as much as possible. So when I look at some of the numbers that are presented, it's a lot to take in. But I think most municipalities would be willing to invest a little more with the levy to ensure that we're processing all permits and applications in the most timely manner. And the other part of that is just always where possible is to under promise and over deliver, because when we do get situations where residents, rightly or wrongly, are frustrated with the process, they tend to eat up a lot of time and within the municipal planning departments as well. So I really think the investment is warranted, and I would certainly support that. So the only other question I had is, even though they're limiting, to core services, Bill 23 could potentially increase the number of permit requests, more than anticipated. But it's hard to do the math as we're going. But when we look at the pay for service, are we in a position that if demand increases, that given the amount that is going to be paid for paid services, that we could add staff as we go? Or is there just way too much legislative regulation to do that? Because I keep hearing that, you can only adjust fees on a certain timeline or whatever. But my concern is obviously that we always are in a position that we can keep up with demand.
Sean Michael, did you have any comment?
Sure. So, yeah, so in terms of, if you're moving forward and you've imposed these fees as recommended, and then the volume of development activity increases significantly such that you actually require additional staff, that wouldn't necessitate a change in fees. It would just mean you're collecting more fees so that you have additional revenue that you could fund additional staff. So if you require more staff to process additional applications, these fees that are set at full cost recovery levels should generate the funds required for those staff positions.
Okay. We have Councillor Horner, or Mayor Horner, I'm sorry.
Okay. Through you, Madam Chair. Just wondering, with the changes coming down from the province on the municipalities, there are certain timelines that are going to be required for processing. Is there, and maybe this is a question that's too soon to ask, is that kind of timeline part of this whole process? Is that one of the reasons that we are trying to anticipate needing more staff in order to turn these applications around faster?
Sean Michael, would you wish to respond?
Sure, I can respond, and perhaps if Chris Hibbert has any additional comments on that, I'll let him jump in as well. But what we've looked at through this is what would the process be that staff would be involved in, and so if that process is going to be undertaken at different stages of the overall development review in response to changes that municipalities are making around beefed up pre-consultation processes, for example, that doesn't necessarily change the level of involvement of staff. And so when we're looking at these additional staff positions, that's in response to the current essentially pre-Bill 23 scenarios in which you need additional staff positions already to provide your desired service levels. And so I don't know if Chris, if you have anything further to add.
Sure, through the chair. So Sean's report really focused on Bill 23, and I think Mayor Horner, you're referring to Bill 109, and we're very much aware of that and having discussions with all of our municipalities and the expectations and the pressure that puts on our municipalities, especially in terms of potentially returning fees. It doesn't affect our fees, but it does affect the service that our municipalities will require from us. So adding more staff certainly addresses our current needs, but we're also hoping that we need to be nimble enough to be able to address those increased pressures as well. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and do a quicker turnaround as well then. So the municipalities don't end up having to return those fees. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. CAO Hefner, did you wish to comment?
Yes, through the chair, if I may. Just for a historical perspective for the board members that are here, in the last time we did a fulsome review of our fees and worked with Build and different stakeholders, including our municipal partners across the watershed, was 2016. And at that time, the consensus among the group that was participating, our fees were reduced by almost $250,000. So, you know, we did that in order to be good partners and to move forward and to work in a fashion that would accommodate everyone's needs at the time. So I think this is just a really responsible way to look at that review. But from an impact on the NVCA, you know, take the last 6 years and add another $250,000 a year, we may not be in this position. So I think Councillor Belanger raised a very good point in the cost. And I just bring to your point as well, the NVC fees currently represent between 0.2% and 1.5% of the municipal costs. Sometimes we appear to be the low-hanging fruit and the opportunity to be the whipping boy or whipping girl for a lot of sensationalized documentation that occurs in the papers or occurs online. But I think when you see a report like this, you really get an opportunity to see the bare bones of our organization and how we're working to do this. And we were so fortunate that we were able to morph Sean Michael's review from our current practices to accommodate some of these current changes in the legislation. So we're really happy and thankful that he was able to accommodate us there. Thank you.
Councillor Belanger?
Yes, thank you, through the chair. Further to our CAO's comments, I had a very good conversation with Cheryl from HR, who laid out to me quite a bit of the activity that's planned to improve the current situation. But to Doug's point is that when we talk about our municipal planning departments and our elected officials, when we are dealing with frustrated residents, whether it's legitimate or not legitimate, we create an image, and over time, probably very unfairly, there tends to be, at least within my municipality, and I've heard from others, this negative view of the NVCA. And the reality is that the work that's done is very important work, and it needs to be done. It needs to be done effectively. But I think more has to be done to, you know, manage the misconceptions that are out there. Like, I mean, I've learned an unbelievable amount in a short period of time as being on the board related to, you know, what we pay and what we get in return, given, you know, the number of volunteers, given the number of other revenue streams from government and all of those things. But at the end of the day, the reality is the perception is becoming reality within municipalities. And I think there has to be an effort to turn that around. And, you know, somehow in a much more Reader's Digest version, we have to communicate to councils at large and planning departments at large of a lot of the information that we're receiving as board of directors.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments, and I think there's validity to what you're stating. And I hope that as board members, you know, you have learned and will continue to learn about some of the work that this organization does and the value of it. So thank you for that. Any further questions or comments for Sean Michael? We do. If not, we do have a proposed resolution that the Board of Directors received the presentation and report regarding program rates and fees review. And I have that moved by Mayor Anderson and seconded by Councillor Porter. Is there any discussion on the motion? If not, I would ask that you go to on board and vote on that motion.
Through the chair, that motion has carried.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Sean Michael, for being here this morning and sharing your report with us. We appreciate that information. And the topic may come up again towards the end of the year. We'll see how things unfold with other possible legislations coming forward. Thank you very much.
Very welcome.
So the next item on our agenda, we have a report on our forestry program from our manager of forestry, Rick Grillmare. Rick, I will turn it over to you.
And thank you through the chair. I'm just waiting for the presentation to come up.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak today, to talk about the forestry program and to give you an update on what happened in the 2023 spring plant. So next slide, please. We are a program of one full-time person, being myself. That's the fellow on the left-hand side of the screen. I started on contract in 1992, and in 1997 was put into the forestry program. And through the program, I think we've planted about still over 2.8 million trees. I also get help from Spencer McDonald, who works in lands and operations during peak seasons. So he helps sort of April, May, a little bit of work in June, July, and then September, October. So he supervises a planting crew, does some of the prep work, the follow-up work, and survival monitoring. So next slide, please. I thought I'd give a brief history of tree planting. Also, being a bit of a history buff myself, there's any opportunity to talk about what's happened and show old photographs, I really appreciate. A large part of our watershed was, they started settling 1831 to 1841, moving from the south. I particularly found the slide of them pulling pine stumps interesting because every now and then I still come across pine stump fence rows, often in old woodlots, especially in sort of the Alliston area with the sand plains. We settled the area and began to create farms and communities by changing the watershed. So next slide, please. By about 1900, too much area had actually been cleared. Some parts of the watershed weren't really suitable for agriculture. We just started coming across things called wastelands. And if you look at the upper right corner, right smack in the middle of our watershed are the sort of the sand plains and Alliston, Angus, areas that are now Simcoe County forests. There was a great threat with dried up streams and degraded farms, sort of 1909. Next slide, please. It's interesting in that tree planting actually has its roots in agriculture. There was something called the Ontario Tree Planting Act of 1883, where landowners were encouraged to plant trees as a means of preventing what they called further degradation of agricultural lands. And the program was really simple. You were paid 25 cents a tree to transplant something from the back of the farm to the front of the farm. I need to get a hold of Mr. Borkson to try to do a follow-up picture of these trees planted in Dufferin County along the side of the road. What's also really interesting is a lot of these programs, the trees were positioned to dump snow on the road, which made it easier for you to get around in the wintertime with your sleigh. Whereas now, if we plant trees beside the road, it's to keep the snow off the road because we have automobiles. So it's an interesting change through time. Next slide, please. So starting 1921, municipalities were getting a lot of lands through tax foreclosure, these marginal sandy soils, and they began to set up agreement forests, which were actually managed by the province of Ontario. So the province paid for the planting and everything else. Simcoe County starting in 1922. These agreements were then transferred to the various counties, and that process finished in 1998. This photograph here is actually in our watershed. It was in something they called the Ore Lake Wasteland. The photo was taken by E.J. Zavitz in 1907. He was basically the father of reforestation. And the fellow in the hat is E.C. Drury, who went on to be the Premier of Ontario in 1919 to 1923. And he was also a great proponent of the planting of trees. Next slide, please. So historically, the province was the lead. It's allowed, and there was something called the Woodlands Improvement Act, and landowners who participated in the program put up these green triangle signs, which you can still see across Ontario today, which is interesting because the last signs went out in 1993. And this program allowed the Department of Lands and Forests to work with individual landowners. There was a wide series of provincial nurseries where the government grew the trees for these programs. Our nursery was actually in Midhurst on what is called Nursery Road. The buildings are still there, but that nursery no longer functions. In fact, the last shipment of trees from that nursery was the spring of 1992. We've been planting trees since 64, but during this period, we had a minor role. So we got free trees from the province. We planted the sites that they didn't want through their program. But at the peak, late 70s, early 80s, between the province and landowners buying and planting their own trees and our own planting program, it was nearly 1 million trees a year. Next slide, please. Good things don't last forever. Starting in the early 1990s, the province started to back out or essentially leave the program. Midhurst closed in 92. St. William's down on Lake Erie closed in 97. In fact, the first year I ran the planting program, I think I got either the last or the second last shipment of trees out of St. William's before they closed. The last physical presence of the provincial program was the Ontario Tree Seed Plant in Angus, which closed in 2018. This was a large plant that was operated to receive cones from across the province, process them, extract the seed, put the seed into storage so that nurseries could acquire the seed to continue their program. We actually have a seed orchard in our watershed at Glencairn. Very expensive to establish. A lot of science went into it. Basically, in this particular seed orchard, they went through the 6200 site region, which is our watershed and some adjacent watersheds, took cuttings from plus white pine or ancient old growth white pine, grafted them to rootstock, planted them in the seed orchard on wider spacing. So you have rows of short stubby white pine that think they're 300 years old. And during seed years, the people would collect the cones because this particular seed source was genetically very valuable. The Forest Gene Conservation Association manages the seed orchards now, so they're still there. Somerville has had to acquire its own equipment. Often they were able to buy a lot of the equipment from the tree seed plant to do the seed extraction themselves. Now, the province did fund planting indirectly through the 50 million tree program from Forest Ontario, which we access. The current government then canceled this in 2019. The federal government stepped in at that point to continue the funding. Our current provincial government has had a change of heart, and they're now providing some funds to Forest Ontario, which we also access for 2023 to 24. The federal government is very present in this, and this is how we access something called the 2 billion tree initiative, which there was a lot of press over how the federal government was funding tree planting. We do access that fund via Forest Ontario. Next slide, please. So the question I'm often asked is why an agency with flooding at its core even cares about trees? And I'll get into that in future slides. But so we've been planting since '64. Really, across Ontario, we're the only agency left doing the planting at this scale, which is a large scale. So next slide, please. It's an old slide, but it's a pretty good one, and it draws the connection between forest cover and base flow in rivers. Base flow being, when a river's at its lowest point in the heat of summer, that's the minimum water flowing through it. And it's very coarse, but essentially the more forest cover you have, the more base flow you have during those dry times of year. Next slide, please. Forest cover also decreases peak flows. It doesn't stop flooding, but it smooths out the change between base flow and extremely high flows. And in a greater sense, it helps to mitigate floods. Next slide, please. There's a lot of talk about green infrastructure and the benefits and practices that you can get that. This is a very simple graphic that shows the various water features that you're trying to protect and how tree planting ticks a lot of the boxes because it fits very well with that. So when a landowner plants trees on their property, they usually do so for their own reasons, but the contribution always, in a way, contributes to a greater good. Next slide, please. Plantations, especially the older ones that were established during the big provincial program, are a great source of wood fiber. There is a pretty substantial forest industry in our watershed, with Simcoe County being the lead in the management of their plantations, but a lot of private plantations are being managed as well. Wood is a very carbon-friendly building material, certainly more friendly than concrete and steel. And as these plantations are managed, that wood fiber gets back into the market. Next slide, please. There's a great interest in climate change mitigation and the service that trees provide. So essentially, as trees grow, they sequester more carbon. Younger trees that grow faster sequester more carbon than older trees. And this varies considerably, but there's some very simple math at a course level that, 15,500 trees covers 20 acres, and over 10 years, it's 13 car equivalents. I do also caution people that you can't plant trees to get out of a climate crisis, because there's all these other uses we need for the landscape, but it does fit in and does contribute. Next slide, please. This is how I talk about how the budget works, and it's all about partnerships. Each year we rely on numerous funding agencies to essentially help fund the program. Each participating landowner pays for the service. In fact, the only landowner that I can recall that ever got trees planted for free was the NVCA when we happened to plant on our own property, which is very rare. And that's because there's no budget at the NVCA to pay for this particular service. I've been doing this sort of budget management since '97, and each and every year I'm always amazed at how we're able to convince all these people to provide all this money to keep it going, but we do. And we list Forest Ontario being the peak. We get funds directly from Simcoe County Forestry, so they set aside some money from plantation management to help us plant more trees to the watershed. The town of New Tecumseh, through the roads department, actually have a small budget set up to plant trees in that particular municipality. But the funding flows when we actually do the work. So if we don't plant trees, there's no funding. The only source of funding that flows to forestry, if we didn't plant a tree, would be levy. And I kind of joke that I occupy this strange world between full public and private sector, where the levy, once I've paid for the building, the motor pool, and the computer, the levy covers my salary till sometime in April, and then I cross this threshold and become a private sector tree planter, where I have to plant trees to pay my salary. And this is the single biggest reason why we help any landowner who wishes to plant trees. We've never told someone, no, you can't do that. Next slide, please. Where the trees come from. They're grown by Somerville Seedlings in Everett. It's a private sector nursery. Interesting in that they use a lot of the equipment that came from Midhurst. In this particular photograph, you see migrant workers sowing red oak. We're involved heavily in seed collection when we can, because if the nursery doesn't have the seed, they can't grow it, we can't plant it. That one photograph here showing the black mesh on the ground is we're attempting to try to collect black cherry so that we can get the seed to the nursery so that they can grow the stock for us. We have 13 different species from 2 seed zones and 4 different stock types that we use. This is the size and shape of the tree. And it's been modified after 25 or so years of planting. So we provide constant feedback to the nursery as to what works, and then they grow the material for us, and then we plant it. But our species selection is very much limited by the seed, by the science, and by biology. So what I mean by seed is Conifer seed can be frozen and stored. Hardwood seed cannot. And trees don't produce seed every year, which is why some years we have red oak and some years we don't. Science, there's a lot of science on how to manage certain types of trees, but if we decide to try and plant something new, someone has to figure out how to grow it. And in terms of biology, a lot of the species we plant are adapted for open field situations. They're early successional trees, so their job is to recolonize or reforest sites on their own. No matter how much I would want to, yellow birch and eastern hemlock are never going to be trees we plant at a large scale because they simply won't grow in an open field. Great care is taken to select the best genetics and source of seed as well. So where the seed comes from is incredibly important. Next slide, please. So the 2023 planting season, it was a modest spring by historical standards at only 78,000 trees. We started on April the 24th and we finished May the 17th. We outsource our planting, and we've done this since 1997. So for example, in a 200,000 tree season, and we have had 3 in the past, we needed 2 of these planting machines, the tractor, 3 people to a machine with a support vehicle, a hand planting crew of 5, and a backpack sprayer crew of 3, all with their own vehicles, and we only need them for 6 weeks. So to do this in-house, we just simply don't have the material to do that. Next slide, please. Machine planting is very cost effective and very efficient. A crew of 3 can plant up to 8,000 trees per day. The trees are band sprayed at the time of planting. And it's a big step up from the 1920s when they would run a single moldboard plow across a field and then the fellows would go plant the trees in the slit. Our contractors paid by the tree. The planters themselves are paid by the tree. So it's all about efficiency of movement during the plant. And this is a very efficient way of planting. Next slide, please. If it's a planting site that's too steep, too stony, or too wet, or too small for the tractor, we send in the hand planters. And they cost quite a bit more because it's a lot more effort. But again, it's very effective. They have a harness with bags, they carry the trees across the site, and they use a shovel to plant the trees. You've got to be young to do this. Every year I try to be a hand planter. I last about half an hour, and my 56-year-old lower back isn't really built for that anymore. Next slide, please. Streamside plantings are really important, but they almost always have to be completed by hand and can be difficult. When we meet a landowner, we can try to shift their planting interest to the stream by offering a higher incentive if we have the funds, and that often works really well. Next slide, please. In forestry, you always work 1 year in advance. So we've already started meeting with landowners for 2024. In fact, we often will do site visits while we're in the middle of planting trees. To plant 19 landowners required nearly 40 site visits. So when we visit a landowner, because they express an interest in tree planting, sometimes we can't plant it. Sometimes it's not suitable. Sometimes the landowner changes their mind. But it's a landowner-driven program in that nobody has to do this. So the service we provide has to mesh with what the landowner is willing to host and pay for. The trees are also determined by the soil. And I have a saying I tell landowners, you can't change what the glaciers left you, which is a bit of a mind shift for most landowners, because when they think about planting a garden or a flower bed, they're used to the concept of altering the site to suit what it is that they want. On a large scale, if you're planting 2 or 5 or 10 acres, you basically have to match the tree with what the soil is, otherwise the planting isn't successful. And to do that, you need to get on the site when the ground's not frozen and covered in snow. And so we will do site visits up until about the end of October for the next planting cycle. Next slide, please. Successful tree planting requires, in most cases, that the site is somehow prepared and that the trees are looked after planting. We try to do a lot of this in-house to reduce the cost for the landowner. It is also a way to generate modest revenues to help pay for the program. And this is an example of a site where we visited the landowner a year ahead of time. We have a sprayer mounted on the back of an ATV to spray strips in a stream valley. The hand planters then run down the strip, planting the trees in the grass, which right now is about 6 feet tall. So if you plant a small seedling in 6-foot tall grass without any preparation, the trees will die. We may as well just leave them on the driveway and drive away. Mechanized preparation lowers the cost for the landowner, so we plant more trees. It reduces the time required on a site, so we plant more trees. But it also increases the survival rate, so we end up growing more trees. Next slide, please. This fall is as busy as the spring, even though we only plant in the spring, because every single site has to be monitored. This is required by both the funders, and I consider it the right way to do the job. What we will not do is plant trees and walk away and just leave the trees to fend for themselves. The surveys are used to refine the program from what species work, what spacing works, what application rates if we have to use a herbicide. We learn through mistakes. Sometimes sites aren't successful. We try to do a deep dive to figure out what went wrong and modify the planting so that the next planting becomes more successful. So this fall, we'll visit the sites we planted this spring, we'll visit the sites we planted last year, and we'll visit the sites we planted 5 years ago. And it's about 100 properties that need to be surveyed. What we see through time is that our average conifer survival rate is about 85%, and our average hardwood seedling survival rate is 15%, which is why when you look across a watershed, you see lots of rows of pine and spruce. Because I tell landowners, you always see the plantings that were successful, you never see the plantings that failed. Now, we still try for diversity, but we try to avoid planting large numbers of hardwood seedlings in a field, knowing that they usually don't work. Next slide, please. This is a really good graphic of the typical timeline for the establishment of a tree, and we're involved in almost every single step, with the exception of maybe growing the seedling at the nursery. Although we do provide information, we do help with the seed collection. And you can see that in this trend from when a landowner decides that they want trees to when a seedling is what we call free to grow, which is a fancy forestry term for when the tree is big enough to fend for itself. And that can be 3 years, it can be 7 years. The actual date of tree planting is a very small sliver of that, but there's an incredible amount of work on either side of that date, and we try to be involved in all that. Next slide, please. So being a fan of history, I couldn't resist doing this. I'm often asked why all the pine and spruce, and I say that in many cases, pines work as a great cover crop. And a good example of this, I'm a member of the Forest History Society, and on one of our tours, we got to see what's called the Square Plantation. It was the second planting ever established in Ontario. It was planted in 1903 in a place called Orono, Ontario, which is sort of Peterborough area in general. And this is Francis Square in 1908 looking at his trees. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of the plantation in 1953. Our watershed is filled with plantations in the 70s and the 80s that look just like this. They don't look great. This is Francis Square in 1981. Next slide, please. And this is the plantation today. In forestry, we play the long game. And in this particular case, it was a 110-year process to turn an ugly white pine plantation into something that's really quite amazing. A lot of the hardwoods growing in underneath are called intolerant. They don't grow in open fields. The pine is a cover crop. We found out the hard way that if you try to take an open field and plant those trees, they often don't work. Next slide, please. Arbor Day tree sale is how we reach the urban landowner. It's a one-day event. In 4 hours, we'll sell 4,000 or 5,000 trees for landowners to plant themselves. We sell them in bundles of 10. So if you want 10 of this and 10 of that, it's a great opportunity to go and get trees for your property, for us to provide advice, planting advice, answer all kinds of questions about the trees on their property. Next slide, please. We have special projects, living snow fences, for example. So aside from stream valleys and plantations, we will also try to plant field breaks whenever we can. They're important for road safety. They are a difficult sell, as few landowners are willing to host one. But when we do, if you have a functioning program, you can take advantage of an opportunity. So for example, this particular property on Simcoe Road 10, 2 days ago, I visited a landowner who's setting up an organic farm and he wants some field windbreaks. about a kilometer north of this. He got the idea by driving by and seeing the trees that we planted in the field and the little blue sign we had in the fence row. Next slide, please. The Managed Forest Tax Incentive Program is a tax incentive for landowners who manage their forests. And land under managed forest is assessed at a rate similar to that of farm. And so it's a modest tax incentive for landowners who participate. We will write and approve the plans for them. Most of the plans we write happen to be for landowners who plant trees. So this is a way of getting them to maybe plant more trees or giving them some sort of benefit for that. It's our attempt to go beyond just planting trees to maintaining them in the future and assure that they're surviving and thriving on the landscape. Next slide, please. Challenges, and there are many, every single year. Funding challenges, we work through. Some challenges we just have no choice but to deal with. Drought is a big one. So for example, 2019, we had a localized, fairly severe drought, which caused mortality. Climate change is happening, and we're trying to adapt to earlier and different kind of summers. Some years it rains too much. We just have to roll with it. I tell landowners who are getting trees planted that this is their opportunity to be like a farmer. You know, pray for rain, pray for it to stop raining, pray for it to warm up, pray for it to cool down. Once we've meshed the trees to the site, there's a certain leap of faith to hope that it all works out. Next slide, please. This is an ongoing and serious problem across wide swaths of our watershed. On the left photograph, this is an example of a prominent browse line where the deer have simply eaten everything on the lower cedars up to 2 meters. This wasn't the landowner pruning the edge of his field. This is natural browsing. So on this particular property, not only could we not plant hardwood seedlings, we couldn't plant cedar. We had to find something that was prickly that the deer would leave alone, which ended up being white spruce. On the right-hand side is a picture of Scots pine, which I used to refer to as the ragweed of the forest, but with various other issues, I've softened my opinion on them. And these trees naturally seed, but if it happens to be in an area where the deer congregate in the winter, they get pruned, and we call them bonsai pines. And so they never get more than 4 feet tall. It just is, and we have to adapt to that. Next slide, please. Climate change is one that we're trying to wrap our heads around. Here's an interesting graphic. On the left-hand side, it shows the climate suitability of aspen, which is right smack in our watershed. If projections hold true by 2021, it would be in the well far north, and it would be too warm here to even grow aspen. So are we going to have the climate of Ohio or West Virginia? Well, nobody really knows because they're just estimates. So right now, the best approach is to match the tree to the site to ensure that it's vigorous. And there is some work to try and bring seed from further south to plant into our area. And that's called assisted migration. Next slide, please. So the species we plant now are a result of decades of practice, and to make a shift actually takes a considerable amount of time. So the trees that we planted this spring, some of the species, the seed was collected 5 years ago and then grown and then ready. So if we want to suddenly plant Kentucky coffee tree on a large scale, it could be 5 or 10 years before we get those trees in a large volume. Sycamore is an example of a more southern species we're now planting on a fairly large scale, and that's a picture of a sycamore at year 3. That rectangle at the base is actually my legal sized clipboard. It took several years for the nursery to figure out how to handle the seed, how to germinate it and grow it, and we're now trying it on multiple sites. And when we get to the 5th year survey, we can tell if the site worked or not. And so by constantly refining that, we can figure out how to get more of this tree on the landscape. Next slide, please. Forest lost, emerald ash borer. We're now at the peak of what's called the killing front, where ash are dying widespread and on a large scale. I figure by 2023, 24, most of the ash will be infected and dead or dying. It's a loss of a lot of forest area, but we have no choice but to deal with it. In this particular photograph, it was our attempt to try and plant white pine and European larch in an ash and hawthorn area. This is an old scrubby patch of old pasture that had been allowed to grow in. We sent the hand planters in. They call it stick in the eye tree planting. So they actually had to wear helmets with face shields so that they could bend over and put the trees into the site. And it worked quite well, but it's very expensive. And so right now the best approach is to simply wait for all the ash to die and fall over or be knocked down and then go in and replant it. Next slide, please. So in 2020 and 2021, I called the spongy moth apocalypse was everywhere. There was 1.8 million hectares across Southern Ontario that was defoliated, and much worry and controversy. And then it did what spongy moth always did, was the population collapsed, and it collapsed completely. By 2022, the infestation was down to 58,000 hectares, and now you can't find a gypsy moth anywhere. But at the time, it was really something. We don't know the mechanics of it, why the population explodes. We do know why it collapses, but 8 to 10 years from now, it'll be back. Next slide, please. There are 2 pests on the horizon that are causing a bit of worry. One is the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is this aphid-like insect, and it's the photograph in the upper left corner of the screen. Kills hemlock. It takes a while, but it's been moving up the eastern seaboard. It was found in Ontario in 2012, but eradicated. It's since been found in March of 23, in fact, in Niagara Gorge, Fort Erie, Hamilton, and one site just east of the Greater Toronto Area in Grafton. So it's going to eventually move across our watershed. It won't affect our tree planting, but it will eventually affect forest health. Oak wilt, photograph or the map in the bottom right corner, is a bacterium that affects mostly red oak. When I actually wrote the presentation, it was not yet found in Ontario, but then in June 12th, it was confirmed in Niagara Falls. So it's managed across the water and will now spread through Ontario. We're not exactly sure how it's going to affect our program, but it might mean that we just plant fewer red oak, with shifting the focus to bur oak, because members of the bur and white oak family are more resilient, but it means we have to spend time this fall looking for bur oak seeds so that the nursery can grow more trees so that they're available for our program. These pests are shrinking what I call my palette of trees, native trees that are available at my disposal to plant. So for example, I remember planting ash, and lots of it, because it was quite a successful tree. Obviously, we can't plant it anymore. Butternut had potential, but because of butternut canker is no longer being planted. Red oak, we may be dialing back as well. There are 2 key non-native but non-native species that we plant, Norway spruce and European larch, and they may become more valuable as we start running out of trees to plant. But forests are adaptive and they change, and with a little help, they'll be on the landscape for a long time. So next slide, please. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Rick. And thank you for continuing to form those partnerships and continuing to generate enough revenue so we can carry on with our planting program that really has been very successful. So we do have a proposed motion as part of our consent agenda, but if anybody has any questions or comments for Rick at this time, any members of the board? We're all good? Oh, Councillor Porter?
Yes, sorry, I couldn't find the area to raise my hand on the screen. I just find it very interesting. This is a great program. The number of trees, sorry, I should have said through the chair. I do apologize. But the replacement value of 778,000 trees for every tree cut down is only 304. Got 256 per tree. And I'm just wondering, just as a thought, if there's any way, because it does concern me, particularly with all the clear cutting that goes on by developers. Well, this is great. Absolutely a fantastic. The amount of trees that are replaced across the region served by the Nottawasaga Conservation Area, and even I would say Gray Saba in my case, doesn't match what is clear cut away. So I'm just wondering if there's any way the Conservation Authority can highlight that.
Oh,
Rick.
through the chair. I would love to figure out a way to get those resources, but that seems like a higher level conversation. I'd have to pass that on to the CIO. I don't know. I mean, I know we do access some funding through what's called offsetting, and that helps. But it's certainly worth looking into.
So through the chair, if I may have a follow-up. I'm not saying that perhaps that's something that would reside with Nottawasaga, but rather maybe encourage the individual towns. It's something that I've been thinking about for the municipality of the town of Blue Mountains is really the number of trees that get planted versus the developers that the volume that get cut down and the impact that has on climate change. And I know there's one development in Thornbury West, which will result in 800 trees coming down, which is 250,000 trees and carbon capture. And I just think about ways of educating the public as well. Just a thought.
Thank you. Councillor Blanchet, I see you, but I'm just going to go to CAO Hefner first, if I may. CAO Hefner, did you wish to comment?
Yes, through the chair, if I may. As to the development costs and the charges, one of the ways that municipalities can anticipate this and proactively work with this is through updating and maintaining a very vital tree bylaw within your municipality. I participated in the municipality for the city of Edmonton and had the ability and good fortune to participate in developing 2 tree bylaw programs for the city as well. The challenge we face there is private land development. The property right ownership situation is extremely challenging when we write tree bylaws. There is some mitigation for caliper size on the number of stems that are removed on properties, and you know, we try our best to do that. Rick alluded to a mitigation process called net gains. We utilize this process with developers, and it's based on wetland catchment and land that's deemed undevelopable, and it's going to be lost during the process of development. And it's you may have seen the term cash in lieu, where the developer pays a certain fee. And in our case, it goes into a fund which we manage. And Rick alluded to, you know, planting trees and what they can do for flood protection. Well, planting trees and what you can do for erosion on a riparian bank. Planting trees as a buffer to a riparian bank to reduce the amount of phosphorus load that's leaving the agricultural fields into the soil. Planting trees around catchment areas for sewage plants so we can try to reduce that phosphorus need as well. There's lots of ways that we're trying to do it, but I think your answer is louder voices. The public has to be sequestered and to interest in it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Just CAO Hebner, if you have a tree bylaw with that you feel would be beneficial, could you share that with our member municipalities?
Yeah,
I know that.
Through the chair, if I may, I think probably one of the best tree bylaws in this province of Ontario has been written by the city of Toronto. They have extremely strong forestry program. They also have extremely strong regulatory authority on trees for property owners. So it becomes a question of property rights and the ability to maintain and steward your own lands. So it's a very challenging argument or conversation. But Toronto is probably one of the foremost in the province.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Blanchet, did you have a comment or question?
Well, just through the chair, and again, I'll probably have to do a little bit of follow-up, but I know with a lot of developers is when they are clear cutting, there is a negotiation built into the bylaws where they do have to either cash in lieu or replant to accommodate what was taken down. I'm not sure if it's always 1 for 1, but I certainly know it's been a point of discussion on a lot of the presentations that we received in council. So I'll do a little more on that, but I would think that most municipalities do have some kind of bylaw that does require developers to replant at their own cost often. But I guess my question is does the Conservation Authority get any data on that, or should we be looking at how we collect that data and that it can be added to what the Conservation Authority is doing on their own?
CEO Hebner?
Yes, through the chair to Councillor Belanger, if I may. We're not currently collecting and maintaining that data as per se. We certainly have the ability to participate and offer opinion. I think it's important to look at case studies. If I look at our watershed and I look at the city of Barrie, Barrie created a multiple dwelling bylaw to allow dwellings on their property. And if we know the city and we know the Elmville area, or not the Allendale area around the GO train section, a lot of really mature, some of the most mature red oak and white pine growth in the city in that area. Through the development bylaw assessment, they created a 1.5 meters offset on the boundary between properties. And then we're immediately overwhelmed with mature tree fatality in the whole area. And they had to go back and reassess, and they've changed that to a 7 meter from the property line. So imagine that 2 foot diameter red oak growing up against your fence in your backyard, and your neighbor puts in a secondary dwelling 1.5 meters away from that root system. You've written the death knell for that tree, essentially. So I think when we look at legislation and we look at that, we need to rely on the experts. Most cities have ISA certified arborists. They have foresters that work on hand. Simcoe County provides a tremendous amount of input through their county forester and through their staff. And that's who we rely on for the forestry aspects. Rick's the operational forester on our hand and able to, speak to the silviculture part, the planting part. But I think towns need to invest in forestry. We need to invest in our tree canopy, and we need to marry that with the development and with the agricultural use within our areas. And I think that's important, that trifecta. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Hebert?
I just wanted to add for Councillor Belanger through the chair that through our health checks, we do look at forest cover and percent cover, but it's a very high level look at it. It's not as specific as probably what you're asking.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments on this? I don't see any. Thank you once again, Rick, for your presentation and for all the work that you are doing. And I'm very glad that you're able to generate enough revenue to stay on board.
Thank you. I'm glad to.
Thank you. So we move on our agenda. We have no deputations or hearings. As I said, the motion for this particular item will be part of our consent agenda. So we are moving on to our consent agenda. We have had a request to pull item 12.2.2 and item 12.2.4. Were there any other items that anyone wished to have pulled today? I don't see any. So we'll move on to item 11, which is the resolution moved by Councillor Keysbrink and seconded by Councillor Baines. Resolved that agenda item numbers 12.2 and 12.2.4 were identified as requiring separate discussion, and that they be referred for discussion under item number 12. And further, that all consent list agenda items not referred for separate a discussion, be adopted as submitted to the board and staff and be authorized to take all the necessary action required to give effect to same. And further, that any items in the consent list not referred for separate discussion and for which conflict has been declared are deemed to not to have been voted on or discussed by the individual making the declaration. So of course, there was no declarations today. So if could we all go to our onboard to vote on this?
Through the chair, that motion is carried.
Thank you. Okay, so we will move to item 12.2.2. And perhaps if we could have the motion moved by Councillor Porter and seconded by Councillor Lougheed, that we can open this item up for, I believe, CAO Hebner wishes to comment, and I believe Councillor Belanger, you also had a question about this. So maybe I'll let Councillor Belanger ask his question first, and then we'll get a comment from CAO Hebner. Councillor Belanger?
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, on the update of memorandums of understanding, and it indicated that this is being submitted to the NRF. There were a number of future meetings indicated in the report that occurred on the first week of June 6th. Obviously, those meetings have now taken place. Wasaga Beach was one of them. And I know this is an ongoing process, but I just wondered whether there'd be any further update to the report, because part of the motion is to approve the report being sent to the MNRF. And we're now at June 23rd, and I didn't know whether or not any of those meetings that have now occurred should be updated in the report. Thanks.
Thank you. CAO Hebner?
Yes, through the chair to Councillor Belanger. Joe, you're psychic. It's just a savant. This is kind of an awkward way to do this. I have 17 additions that have happened since I wrote this report. In your report where it talks about reached out to on the phone for follow-up with Innisfil CAO, Oro-Medonte, New Tecumseh, Grey Highlands, so 17 additional items have happened there. I'll just quickly run through them if I may. Both the CAOs for Tecumseh, New Tech, and for Innisfil have responded, and we'll be meeting with staff on June 9th and June 28th. The June 9th meeting resulted in the CAO will be bringing a staff report to council in August or possibly July. Our June 28th meeting will occur with Innisfil, where we're meeting with staff to talk about the MOU and the potential of supporting that. They've talked about potentially coming to forward to council with a joint support for Lake Simcoe and for the NVCA's report. We have met with the Collingwood CEO, Sonia Skinner, and I'll be providing a deputation on July 10th to their council in support of a CAO report supporting our MOU. We're continuing to provide information to Tracy over in Mulmer, the CAO there. She's brought her initial staff report up to her council for questions and answers. Since this date, we've set up a meeting to meet on July 24th with the CAO and staff to go through those questions. And I'm informed by Tracy, she'll be bringing a follow-up report to her board, of which we're happy to attend and as a willing partner and participate in. We met with CEO Jeff McKnight and the staff at Bradford West Gillenberry. They were very supportive of our work. They were going to be meeting the next day with Lake Simcoe, and they anticipate bringing a document through the CAO to council in August. We met with Blink Parkin and New Tecumseh, and they're bringing that report forward in August, as I mentioned earlier. We also attended the Mono Council to support the CEO Mark Early's staff report on June 13th, and that passed. That it became our 6th MOU that we have signed and documented now. We reached out to Barrie, Essa, Oro-Medonte, and Grey Highland to follow up on the MOUs. We've since set up meetings with Grey Highland for June 20th. And we had that meeting, and their CEO has informed us she'll be bringing a supportive MOU staff report to her council. That's Karen Govan in July or August. We met with ESSA. We went down to council. Chris and I met with them on June 21st, and we'll be working with their CEO, Colleen, to develop information for her to aid her in a staff report. They seem to be receptive to the MOU that we have. On June 27th, we'll be meeting with the Committee of the Whole of the Town of the Blue Mountain. We've been working with their Director of Planning, Adam, to develop a process. It has already been approved for Grey Sauble. We use that approval as a template to move forward to seek approval for our MOU as well. So that's happening. Again, I've mentioned that we've set up a meeting in Innisfil, June 28th. We met with we'll meet with the Town of Blue Mountain on the 27th. And we are setting up a meeting right now with Robin Dunn at Oromodante for July 24th. In Springwater, we initially met with CEO Jeff Schmidt and planning and engineering staff. We're looking at trying to find a date when we can come to council and do a deputation. We'd initially set up in this report, I mentioned a July 5th date, unable to attend that. We're looking at potentially an August 2nd date. So with this update, maybe if someone could potentially modify the ask here to include these update changes to be included for the report for July 1st, I would be able to provide that. And when I do, I could copy all of the board members with that, so you'll have an opportunity to read through it as well. That's really all I have, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity.
Councillor Belanger, did you wish to?
Yes, just thank you through the chair. A follow-up. I know we just received the rates and fees recommendations or report today, but is that part of the process in you establishing the new MOUs? Are we discussing the potential changes of rates and fees for next year, and sort of the strategy of potential additional staffing to help streamline the permitting process?
Through the chair to Councillor Belanger, if I may. Yes, we are taking steps to try to address that. We've looked at the great work that Sean Michael and his team have done, and we look at the revenues that we're generating right now. We have been able to bring on one additional certified engineering technician. He's been in place for a little while now and up to speed and now working on his own. So he's helping our other staff there. We're also potentially looking at one of our staff members that is currently on contract, that is currently completing her CET, as potentially being able to move into that supportive role as well. Cheryl, Chris, and team have been very, very active in the human relations aspect. We've interviewed for our water resource engineers. We've interviewed and are continuing to interview for a manager of engineering. We made an offer to a gentleman for water resources. Unfortunately, as the things play out, this morning he informed us that he has now considering a position with another area. We've counter-offered that and asked the gentleman if he'd be interested in talking further with us and see if we can get him in the door. But if not, we'll be reloading that position to try to replace that. Currently, we're down 2 engineers. Our senior engineer has joined the City of Hamilton, and our second most tenured engineer joined the Conservation Authority in Halton. So we are looking at ways to do that aspect. As far as costs and services, programs and services, we delivered to the staff of all of our municipal partners in 2022, the programs and services. And how we delivered that, we delivered it in a 5-year average costing from 2016 to 2022. We've augmented that with the 2023 budget that shows how the potential cost. That average costing came in between $5.5 and $5.6 million in total. I believe our 2023 budget is rolling through at about 5.6 to 5.7. We're constantly looking at things that may affect us in the future without any human relations additions or costs to new employees. We're looking at a potential of a 5 to 6% increase of cost of living, which will see a bit of a growth in our dollar value for our budget. We've expressed all these costs to the CEOs of all of our municipal partners, and they've had that opportunity to look at it and question it. We haven't had a lot of feedback from staff on individual costs, per unit costs. And to date, all of the municipalities that we've worked with have been strongly supportive of a status quo budget moving forward. We've set up the MOU so that the budget is Appendix A. So in the 4-year term of the MOU, the budget will be evaluated in each year for a 30-day period. In the NVCA, we grant an extended 30 days. So we make a 60-day availability to our partners to look at those nuances. Our new budget stream will include a separate breakout of all Category 1 or mandated services, all Category 2. Category 2 services could be similar to what we saw as special levy needs in the former budgets that you've seen in the past. When we look at the budget from 2023 to the turnover to the 2024 budget, there won't be a lot to recognize. It'll be a completely new format that breaks out that cost 1, cost 2, cost 3. So it will be, as I've explained this to the councils and the CEOs that I met with, this is an exercise in transparency. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to really clearly provide our costs and our needs to our partners. And I think that's exceptional. It's given us a really good opportunity to make a forensic look into our accounting, and happy to do that. So I think it's very, very beneficial. I think we should also look at that when we look at the costing and we look at Category 2 and Category 3 items. You know, when this first came about, it was almost like people were salivating and saying, boy, we're just going to take out all the Category 2 and all the Category 3. We're going to have a tremendous cost savings. That's not really the way it works. Like, the levy is set up to be charged per municipality. There's so much funding that's available to a conservation authority through the levy system. If we had Category 2 and Category 3 items cut within our budget, we would discern and say, okay, well, 18 of the municipalities don't want to support or want to support education, 2 don't. Could we make a calculation again and say, okay, what would the shared costs for everyone be if we only had 16 municipalities supporting it? And we would not provide education to the 2 non-providing. So that's one method. The other thing to consider is there's lots of work that we can't do right now, you know, that we could possibly do. So if we removed Category 2 or Category 3 items, as good stewards of the provincial dollars that are coming our way and the municipal dollars that are coming our way, we would reevaluate our Category 1 programs. We would do watershed need assessment, and you'd sort of probably see a very net balance. You drop the Category 2, Category 3, you spend that in Category 1. So it's kind of a due process of net gain here for how the budget reads out. We've only had one municipality so far, and that is Mulmer, that has some questions about the support for forestry, the support for natural heritage, and support for education. And I think when we have conversations with Tracy and staff, we may be able to provide some more light on that and it, you know, maybe drop. But these conversations have just been really great. And kudos to your staffs and to your CEOs and the senior managers we've worked with. It's been great. It has been a great dialogue. I think we've both learned a lot about each other. And I'm happy to say that it took a while to get this going, but it's full on. People are invested in it. There's great dialogue, great questions. And I hope everybody wins on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Blanchet, a follow-up?
Yes, just to follow up through the chair, and Doug, kudos to your staff. I had a comprehensive discussion with Cheryl the other day, and she provided a lot of insight on what's going on. But I think we have to anticipate, I believe most municipalities are seeing a lot of movement within their planning departments. Some of the planning positions are very specialized, and it's not uncommon for us to have to abandon what have been the established job rates and increase the offers in order to get the right people in the positions that we need. And certainly you're no different. And I've heard examples like in, I don't know if it was East or West Caledon, where they went to their council and they had to increase $20,000 over job rate to fill their planning positions. So I think we have to anticipate that in order to get the right people and maintain them, because the private sector also has a lot more flexibility. If they need somebody and they want the right person, they're increasing the offers, and retraining and all of that has a huge expense too. So when you come to the municipalities, we need to anticipate that those positions may cost a little more going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Director Flanagan, did you wish to comment?
Microphone.
Can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, there we go. It didn't work when I pressed it. CAO Heavener had mentioned an amendment to the resolution in order for him to update with the updates that he had just given you. So I was just following up, recommending that if Councillor Porter and Councillor Lougheed are in agreement, that we could change the resolution to say further that NVCA's Board of Directors approves this progress report in fulfillment of OREG 687-21 as discussed, to be submitted to the province's MNRF by July 1st, 2023. And that gives the CAO the freedom to then add what he discussed before he sends it off to MNRF. So I was just following. Okay, I see that Councillor Lougheed is fine with that. Councillor Porter, you're okay with that? Okay, so I'm just making that change right now in onboard, and so it'll be live when you're ready to vote, Chair.
Oh, okay. I was wondering about just changing the first part where it says resolved that the update. I was just going to suggest that the update on progress reports for the memorandum of understanding as presented on June the 23rd. But if your wording covers it all, I'm fine with that.
Through the chair, why don't we do it in both sections?
That would be,
if they are in agreement to that. Mover and seconder. Yeah, Councillor Porter's fine. Councillor Lougheed, yes. Okay, perfect. So just give me 30 seconds to make those changes and save it before you call for a vote.
Okay, we will wait. And while we're waiting, I just wanted to emphasize again the work involved in this with our small CA, but we have 18 members that we have these MOUs to negotiate. And that's probably more than most of the CAs have. So we have a lot more work in order to get these MOUs in place. So I appreciate the work that the staff are putting into this and the opportunity to interact with all our members. It has been very valuable.
Through the chair, I have saved it.
Okay. So
do you want me to read it again, or?
Would anybody like to hear it again, or are we all clear on the rewriting, what it's going to be? I think we're all good. So if we could just go to our on board and cast your votes, that would be great, and we can then move forward.
Through the chair, that motion is carried.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So the next item that was pulled is item 12.2.4. And again, we had a motion proposed, moved by Mayor Horner, seconded by Councillor Belanger. I won't read it just yet, but I know that I believe Councillor Belanger, you had a question or comment about this item as well. Did you wish to speak on this?
Yes, through the chair. Again, when I can't speak for all municipalities, but I look at the minor and major permits, the timelines. And I see in the report for Wasaga Beach from January 1st to June 10th, that it indicated that 40 out of 41 applications have been dealt with and 40 met the required timeline. And, you know, I share this information, but it meets with a little bit of skepticism sometimes, given the number of resident concerns that are brought forward. And keep in mind that a lot of times there's a lot more information and the resident doesn't always tell the whole story. But I was wondering, in the report going forward, I think there would be some real benefit to understand day one, the first date an application was received and the date the application was completed. Because as you know, as every time something is deemed incomplete or another piece of information is required, the clock starts over. So I think if we knew the exact length of timeline from when it was received initially, not pre-consultation, but when the application was submitted and when it was completed, we would then have a better picture to understand if the process, even though we're doing everything in accordance to what we have indicated, if the process is resulting in longer timelines, it will allow us then to analyze and say, okay, if we're having to go back to a resident 3 or 4 times or twice or whatever it is to get more information and start the clock over, then what do we have to do to eliminate that issue? How do we better communicate or whatever? The other thing, in fairness, and this is not a criticism, it talks to process, but CEO Hevner has been very active working with me directly on some of the cases that have been problematic. But in all honesty, there's communication breakdown. Like in one event, there was going to be some things done to potentially move something forward. And then I get contacted from the resident 3 weeks later, and they claim they haven't heard anything. And I'm not into the position to say whether the resident is accurate or not. But if we knew day one to completion and we knew what that length of time was, then we can analyze the process and say, what can we possibly do better to tighten up that time frame? So those are my comments.
Okay, thank you. I see Mayor White, but before I go to you, Mayor White, I also see that CAO Hevner and Director Hebert perhaps would wish to comment.
Yes, through the chair, if I may. Thank you, Joe, for that and for your active participation in asking questions. It's extremely difficult to put a bullseye on the permit will take this long. I'll give you another example of a case study. I got a call from and an email follow-up from the CEO of Lake Simcoe region, who got a call from the chair of the board of York region, who said, hey, what's up with this permit? I got a phone call from the developer. And it's been, what are they doing over there at the NVCA? It's delayed, it's delayed, it's delayed. So you go through the file and you find the information, and I've sat in this chair now for 6 years, and this has been the scenario that I go through when we have these situations. The file's non-compliant. They went in and they did things that were illegal. That's how it started. So it's non-compliant. So the planning process stops when you're non-compliant. So that's followed up with 16 individual revisions of the information they sent to our team to try to, right the ship and make everything work. Yet the day the last revision comes in, the phone call goes to York region. The phone call goes to Lake Simcoe. Hey, we're waiting. What's going on? We sent all our information in. That shadow argument is there on just about everything. And when you look at these numbers, you're looking at 2% of the files within Calc, maybe 7 or 8% of the files within the 60-day term limit on how we work. We're talking about less than 10%. If we go back to the Watson report and we look at the time that we're spending chasing ourselves, running around on non-compliance and on questions and concerns, that's the chewer on the time. Because unfortunately for us, the person that's working on your file, that they take their hat off and they put off, I'm not working on the file, and they pick up their regulatory hat and they go out and they deal with what's happening live in the field that day. Ben and his team and Chris are working really diligently to try to come up with some way that we can have that kiosk aspect, maybe a city view, maybe something that Simcoe County is working on right now. Maybe there's a delivery where we can have that ability for the proponent to go into the file system and say, there's my file, here's where it's at, here's what we got to do, that's what you have to, how do we move through? On the file you cited on the 3 weeks, I'll say, and I don't usually use this word very often, but the promise made was, we'll make sure the engineer has an opportunity to look at that next week. We also identified that that file was number 22 in the rota of files that we're handling. The engineer did indeed look at it, pass that information on to the regulations officer, but unfortunately, the regulations officer has been up to her boots in regulation authority on the field live action and not been able to reach out. Following up with her yesterday, she is then reaching out to the proponent. That's how that 2 to 3 week window happens over and over and over. And hey, I get permits. I understand it. I certainly appreciate it. But until we find that loaded system that we can move on, I don't know the answer. And I'm sorry, and I apologize on behalf of our staff for that. But you know, they're working hard. They're professionals, and I know you realize that. So. Thank you.
Okay. First, I'm just going to go to Director Hebert. Did you wish to add anything to that response?
Through the chair, Councillor Belanger, we'll look at adding those dates, see what they're possible. It may make for a longer report for the board, but we'll certainly look with Megan Kieferly and her team what's possible.
Okay. Did you wish to have a further question, Councillor Belanger?
Well, just a follow up. I want to make sure that everyone understands it's not a criticism. What happens is that, you know, the resident is the one that is communicating to mayors and councils and deputy mayors and directors of planning, and often the information they're providing is very one-sided, based on their requirement, their frustration. And then when we peel the onion a little bit, we find out what our CAO just told us is that there's a lot of behind the scenes things that have resulted in some of the delays. So, but what's happening is, I think at the municipality level, they're getting this misconception that it's just the NVCA is very slow in processing their applications, when in fact there's often very valid reasons, but somewhere in that process our overall communication is not resulting in, I guess, the desired understanding on the part of sometimes the resident, but more importantly on the part of municipalities and decision makers. And so to the CAO's point, if we had a file, if we knew there was an issue with a particular application, and we could go into a file and see all the touch points or see all the comments without having to do the follow-up phone calls and the chasing around, and that obviously would be a benefit. So again, it's just about, there's always a way to have continuous improvement, and hopefully going forward we'll find some opportunities to take that less than 10% down to 5 or 4 or less. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for raising that concern. Mayor White?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, through the chair. I just wanted to add a little bit, and I certainly get where Councillor Belanger is coming from. And I don't have any issue with sort of adding in those dates, sort of real timeline Gantt chart kind of dates, if people think that would be helpful. But I would think that an explanatory note would be in order as well, because for those of you who don't know, when I'm not busy being the mayor, I'm a general contractor, and over the time horizon of the last 25 years, I've worked for a number of other general contractors. And I can tell you from that perspective, it's often, the delays are often caused by that side. And not only are they often caused by that side, but sometimes they are intentionally caused by that side in order to try to add a chaos element to the system in order to, ultimately move the end or the goalposts at the end of the day. So every situation is different, and I mean, quite often it's not the municipality's fault or the NVCA's fault. But I mean, I think it's important to at least note that while we try to meet the legislated timelines all the time, given the elements of chaos around building and different projects and different types of projects, often that's just not possible. Even if everybody goes into it with the best of intentions. So I think sort of an explanatory note, something along those lines would be helpful to anybody in the public trying to consume the information that we're putting forward, to understand exactly what causes the delays, and it's not that anybody's trying to intentionally be a roadblock. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I appreciate it. Councillor Porter, did you have a comment?
Yes, I did. And through the chair, I mean, from what I understood, and I mean, it only affects the town of Blue Mountains in a very small way, but I think in dealing with a resident is, are you in compliance with what's required? Because there is the responsibility of the person who submits the information for it to be complete. So, I mean, I understand in talking to residents, they don't often, there are times they don't provide what's required, but I think that's the first question to ask, because it actually creates unnecessary work if you have to keep going back. So just looking to place responsibility of the provision of information where it actually belongs. And in fact, I would really worry if someone is wanting a permit and going through the process and they're repeatedly having to draw on the authority to repeatedly and I might even add, potentially unnecessarily handle it. They should actually be charged more.
Thank you. Megan, I see that you would like to comment on this.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, thank you to the chair. I guess I'll be the one to address some of the staff report, as I'm also the person Doug was referring to with her boots in the trenches on a day-to-day basis. So I'll, I guess, do my best to address both Councillor Belanger as well as the comment that just came, because yes, it is true. We do get quite a few compliance issues within the watershed. They do get handled slightly differently than the standard permit application. But to circle back to what Councillor Belanger was saying in regards to how we determine the application to be complete, that often does lead to some confusion with the residents, and we have acknowledged that. We get verbiage and information filtered down from Conservation Ontario on what those calc timelines are, and that verbiage is sometimes very confusing. So we've done our best over the last few years to try to adjust our communication strategy, working with our communications coordinator on how to better relay that information into a way that it's a little more understandable. Because you're right, there's a very large difference between what is considered complete and the actual timeline on issuing the permit. So even though an application has potentially been in the file queue for a year, it may have only been complete 7 days before the permit was actually issued. So there has been this ongoing back and forth between regulations technicians, potentially myself, technical staff such as engineers and ecologists, the applicant, as well as then their potential contacts. So their contractors, their engineers. So that date of file completion versus the date of the permit issue is what is being reflected in that staff report. And those timelines are typically quite short because once we get the clearance or the sign off from technical staff to be able to issue the permit, we try our best to get that permit out as soon as possible. So that may be some of the confusion. And yes, we do have a way that Chris was mentioning. The staff that prepare the reports, we see all these numbers. So we see the date of intake, the date of completion, the date of status updates. We see all that in our system and we can run those very easily. We just don't produce them for the board because it would be a very, very large report with a lot of dates that may or may not make sense to the average person reading it. So we can come up with a way to better explain it. It won't be as condensed as the one you see now, but it might be a little more helpful. So hopefully that addresses some of the questions that you both had.
Thank you, Megan. Councillor Belanger?
Yes, through the chair, just one last comment, and certainly the COI and I had conversations, but some of the most challenging cases that I've dealt with so far was a resident that was deliberately and knowingly trying to circumvent every piece of legislation and policy that there is. So, and certainly they're not forthcoming when they're complaining to a planning department or to a mayor or to a councillor. They're not forthcoming with that information. So that's a back and forth. So I think somebody else said that the deliberate chaos that is sometimes added into the mix it does occur. And some people want to do something that clearly shouldn't be done, and they exercise every possible avenue to circumvent policy. So it's not an easy task. So we understand that. It's just looking for those opportunities to increase the level of understanding and frankly improve communication through the whole process. So thanks again.
Thank you. And we appreciate your comments and the comments of our other board members. And I'm sure that staff will take those into consideration to see if there's any revisions or that could be made or improvements that can be made. So thank you very much. If there are no further questions or comments, we will move on to the resolution. So I have it moved by Mayor Horner, seconded by Councillor Belanger. Resolved that the NVCA Board of Directors receive staff report number 260623 BOD that summarizes the permits and approvals issued by the staff for the period January 1st, 2023 to June the 10th, 2023. Any discussion on that motion? If not, I will ask you to go to your onboard to vote.
Through the chair, the motion is carried.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of our consent agenda today. Is there any other business that anyone wishes to bring forward? Vice Chair Scott?
Thank you. I'd like to bring forward a motion about right to repair that my council passed and was submitted as correspondence to municipalities and conservation authorities. I think what I'd essentially like to do is raise it as a notice of motion now so we could include it on a subsequent agenda for discussion.
Okay, so you would put that forward as a notice of motion then for our next agenda, which will be in August?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. We could, I'm sure we can incorporate that. And any other new business? Oh, Director Flanagan?
Sorry, through the chair, if I can just have Vice Chair Scott send myself and carry his motion before the end of July, so we can get that included, that would be appreciated.
I believe you have it already, but I certainly can.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we do have, if there's no other new business, we do have a proposed closed session, which to deal with litigation matters. You were presented with a report in the closed session document. So I guess it would be, if there are any questions, or do we wish to move into closed? Director Flanagan, is it necessary if there are no questions?
So through the chair, it really is dependent on the board. This is the first legal status update that they are receiving. So if there are any questions or trying to understand what it is, we can definitely go into closed session. However, if they find that it is clear enough and understanding of it, then we can skip going in camera and go straight to the voting. However, just make sure there can be no discussion outside of camera with this.
Right. Thank you. So, yeah, so there were a number of summaries that were of issues presented, and if there are any questions, we can move into closed. Does anyone have any questions on that report? I'm not seeing any. Just want to make sure. So then we do not need to move into in camera. So that would take us to our motion to adjourn.
No, through the chair, sorry, you'd have to do 15.1. You still have to do the motion. Yes.
Okay, so we do have a proposed motion moved by Mayor Coughlin, seconded by Councillor Baines, resolved that staff report number 280623 BOD be received regarding the NVCA legal status update. Any discussion? So I would ask you then to go and cast your vote.
To the chair, that motion is carried.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So our next motion is to adjourn. And I just wanted to remind all our board members that our next meeting will be in August the 25th, and it will be in person at our Tiffin Center. And we will be having a barbecue for lunch, I believe. And there will be an opportunity to meet with staff, and there will be awards that are presented. So I hope that everyone can make that make that meeting in person. And if there is time that day before lunch, we may have staff may provide us with a tour or some other information that you get to absorb the Tiffin Center a little bit while we're there. So if I have a motion moved by Deputy Mayor Van Staveren and seconded by Councillor Baines, resolved that the meeting adjourn at 11:12 a.m. to meet again on August the 25th, 2023, or at the call of the chair. So if we could go to cast our vote on that.
And through the chair, as always, the fastest passing motion is this one. It has carried.
Okay, well, thank you so very much for attending this morning, and hope to see you all on August the 25th. Take care. Have a great summer in the meantime.